Hey guys, this is Nirpam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. As many of you may know, just yesterday Sony announced a very exciting and special camera called the Sony A1. It is one camera to rule them all. It does not compromise. It's Sony's new flagship camera that is the best in its class for both underwater photo and underwater video. Therefore, I thought I'd come out with a video of my initial thoughts on the system, how it's going to change underwater photography and underwater video, and what this means for you as an underwater creative. So to start, I thought I would cover some of the photography features of the Sony A1. The A1 has a 50 megapixel sensor that is slightly less resolution than the Sony A7R4, but it's still one of the highest resolution sensors on the market, and we don't expect there to be that much difference between the 61 megapixel sensor in the A7R4 and the 50 megapixel sensor in the A1. What makes the Sony A1 so special is the processing power in the body. So the new processor, called the Bionz XR processor, allows for new technology with the sensor, specifically related to the electronic shutter. At 50 megapixels, the Sony A1 can take 30 frames per second burst shooting with the electronic shutter and 10 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, which is pretty revolutionary considering how large those file sizes are going to be. What does it really mean for underwater photographers when we say that the burst shooting speed is 30 frames per second? Well, most strobes can't keep up with 30 frames per second when it comes to burst shooting. There are a few strobes like the CNC YSD3 which might not have recycle time, and if that's the case, the YSD3 doesn't have recycle time below 1/4 power. So if you're in a really dark situation, you don't need much strobe light, you could theoretically shoot at 30 frames per second with a strobe like that and get some really amazing high-speed images. For most people that are shooting pelagics in tropical water, they need a lot of power. Their recycle time is going to be, 1.6 seconds. In those cases, you're not going to get your flash in every photo if you are shooting at 30 frames per second, but what you are going to get is a few photos with flashes and a few photos without. So for pelagic photographers, I think 30 frames per second is particularly exciting. What we have yet to see is if that's going to be 14-bit RAW or if it's going to be less data in that RAW file. But what's even more exciting than the burst shooting speed with the Sony A1 is really the improvements that have been made to the electronic shutter. So for those of you that don't know, the electronic shutter is used by the camera to take silent photos, and the way it does that is it takes a full readout of the sensor, and that's basically your image, without having a mechanical shutter in place. That's why you can get a silent photo. Now, historically, electronic shutters have been used in a way where the data will be read out linearly down the sensor, and that's resulted in a few phenomena which have caused problems for photographers in general. So the first issue with an electronic shutter is called rolling shutter, and what that means is because the shutter is not instantaneous, if you have any movement with the camera body or a quick movement with your subject, you can get distortion in your image that looks kind of bent, it looks jello-y, and that's called rolling shutter. That can also happen with your video. So with incandescent lighting, the light actually flickers at a very high rate, and the Sony A1 should be able to sense how quickly that light flickers, and it'll be able to get rid of any banding issues in incandescent light with a silent shutter. Because the processor is so much better in the Sony A1, perhaps the most exciting thing about the camera is that you can now take silent photos with strobes, which means underwater you can be completely silent with your shutter and still get that strobe photography and get colors in your images. That is not a technology that we've had before, and that's going to be exciting in the future to use, and I think a lot of photographers are going to find it enjoyable that there's not going to be some clicking sound underwater when they're taking photos. The A1 has a max sync speed of 1/400th of a second with an external flash and with an external strobe. For underwater photographers, that's a huge deal because you can now shoot in high ambient light situations at 1/400th of a second with your strobes, and you can get sunball photos where the sunballs are very detailed, and you can take you can take macro photos with good black backgrounds because you can eliminate all that ambient light with a high shutter speed. Most cameras currently can only do 1/250th of a second, so 1/400th of a second is almost a full stop of exposure more that you can dial down that ambient light. Another exciting feature for photography is the improved autofocus system. Now with the Sony A9 II, which is kind of the predecessor to the A1, the autofocus system was already top of the line and very accurate. Sony's claiming that the autofocus system on the A1 is actually 30% more accurate than the A9 II. So I'm very excited to get in the water and see if that is indeed the case. Another exciting thing with the A1 is that the autofocus tracking for animals has been improved. Now Sony is claiming that the autofocus tracking works on birds and bird eyes. We did see the same thing with the R5, and that those bird eye photos kind of translated to fish. So the R5 from Canon is actually really good at tracking fish eyes, and we're hoping that the Sony A1 will be able to be just as effective, if not better. And if that is the case, it's going to be even more compelling for underwater photographers, because now they're going to be able to basically take out their camera, point it at a fish, and it should be able to track the fish's eye, and you'll be able to get nice, perfect in-focus photos without having to do anything. So you can focus on your composition, you can focus on your settings and your lighting. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the Sony A1 for underwater video. So the nice thing about the A1 is that it's basically an upgrade from the A7S III. We just reviewed the Sony A7S III, so be sure to check out our review on the Underwater Photography Guide at Blue Water Photo, and also the video review on our YouTube page. Anyway, so it took the A7S III and then they just upgraded it, and now there's higher resolution video. So what you can do with the A1 is you can now shoot 8K video oversampled from 8.6K, so that's basically taking those full readout of the 50 megapixel sensor and downsampling that to 8K, so you get really detailed 8K video that's up to 30 frames per second, and there is a recording limit of about 30 minutes, but Sony didn't specify if it would overheat or if you could record past that 30-minute limit in another file. Now if that's the case, then it could be possible that the A1 will be recording for longer than the R5. The A1 is supposed to be equipped with the Sony A7S III's cooling system. That's pretty revolutionary, so I do have a feeling that the A1 will take 8K video longer than the R5 can. If that's the case, it's going to be a more compelling reason to shoot with the A1 versus the R5. Now, on top of that, the A1 can also do 4K oversampled, so you have really detailed 4K video at 120 frames per second. And that's going to be huge for underwater videographers that need to stabilize their video and use that slow motion effect almost like a gimbal, and that's something that I do a lot. I tend to slow down my 120 frames per second video down to 30 frames per second. I found it very useful on the R5. You can check out some of our R5 sample footage on our YouTube page, and I'll put a link below. But overall, I'm very excited. I'm even more excited for 4K at 120 frames per second than I am for the 8K. But for macro videographers that need that crop, 8K video is really exciting because you can crop into 4K and you can have a whole 4K video, but that crop's gonna let you get a lot closer to your subject, get a lot more detail out of that frame, even though you're up close. So it appears with an initial look at the A1 that the camera will not be able to record RAW video internally, but it will be able to record RAW video externally at 16-bit on an external recorder. That's in line with Canon, except Canon goes one step farther with the R5, and that you can record internal RAW video. That being said, the full gamut of Sony's log profiles are included with the A1, unlike the A9 II, and that's pretty exciting for us. That means all the features you'll find on the Sony A7S III are in that A1, including cine log profiles, hybrid log gamma, Sony S-Log2, S-Log3, and what those logarithmic profiles allow you to do is capture details from your shadows and your highlights, and it puts it, compresses it all into a file that shows you everything and looks kind of flat, but when you take it onto your video editing software and you process it and you color grade it, then you get more details, you get better colors. As you would expect, the A1 does record 10-bit 422 internally, so that you can use 10-bit video footage with your log files, and you can get the best selection of data. And all of this data can be recorded to 2 CF Express Type A slots, or they double as UHS Type 2 SD card slots. I do recommend CF Express Type A cards. They are expensive, but they have really fast write speeds and they're less likely to be corrupted than the SD cards. The new active steady shot stabilization system that was introduced with the A7S III is also in the A1. Now, in our review of the A7S III, we found it to be pretty effective. We were able to shoot handheld video, both wide angle and macro, without using a tripod underwater, which is pretty impressive given that conditions can be kind of rough on the Pacific coast. Now, that being said, the active steady shot mode is not as good as Canon's in-body image stabilization that can correct up to 8 stops. The A1 has been improved and it can now correct up to 5.5 stops. Or I would like to see the A1 perform better, and I do hope that it might perform better than the A7S III, but the A7S III's stabilization was just as good. So finally, let's talk about price. Maybe I should have started with the price. But basically, the Sony A1 body is going to retail for $6,500, and it should be shipping in early March. Now, $6,500 sounds like a lot, but the A1 is basically Sony's new flagship full-frame mirrorless camera. It's what they're coming out with to say, hey, this is the best that we have for photo and video. This is the best of both worlds. Once you pay for this, you don't have to pay for anything else. This is the one camera to rule them all. And that's something that we just haven't seen from Canon or Nikon when it comes to full-frame mirrorless camera yet. Do I think the price is worth what you get? Well, if you need the best of the best for both photo and video, I would say it's definitely worth the $6,500. If you can compromise a little bit, particularly on the video side, I think the Canon EOS R5 is still going to be a very good camera, and that's significantly less expensive at $3,800. So it's something to consider. But if you think about the Sony A1 as being an equivalent to the Canon 1DX Mark III, or the Nikon D6, it's by far a better system than either of those, and it's really going to be the best hybrid camera you can get on the market. I feel like I was just saying that with the R5 coming out, but this is a whole nother category of camera. Anyway, we hope you like this pre-review. We're really looking forward to getting in the water with the camera. Basically, as soon as we get a housing and a body, we're going to be in the water. We anticipate that's going to be within the next month or two. So make sure you check up on our channel, on our YouTube channel, on our social media, Facebook, Instagram. Check out the Underwater Photography Guide. That's uwphotographyguide.com, and Blue Water Photo Store will have reviews on both sites of the Sony A1, and we're really looking forward to trying out this camera. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment. I'll be checking that every day, and yeah, let me know if you guys think that this is actually going to be revolutionary for underwater photo and video, if it's just hype like it was with the R5 in many cases, what you're excited for most. I know for me, it's probably going to be it's going to be that sync speed, that 1/400th of a second sync speed, and also the burst shooting when I'm shooting without strobes. I find that to be pretty exciting. And yeah, thanks for watching.